Mr. Dellum's budget analysis is available, and we're going to be getting that out now as well. The unenviable task of following Ron Dellum's eloquence is something that no one can relish. And what is nice is after Ron Dellum's superb speech, I can be real brief and tell you where we are in the program and what is forthcoming. We're next going to have a panel discussion with Lawrence Korb of the Brookings Institution, Randall Forsberg with the Institute for Defense and Disarmament Studies, and John Steinbrunner from Brookings. Each of them will make a short presentation, then we're going to throw it open to a panel discussion. Let me just say a couple of words as we move to these panelists. As I mentioned when we began the program today, I have been particularly troubled by the fact that there has never been a good rationale as to why our country is spending triple what our nearest competitor is. One of the reasons that Congressman Frank and I wanted to have Lawrence Korb on this particular panel is that he has been a true leader in the effort to look down the road at what the real costs of some of these high-tech weapons would be, these weapons that seem more to be a public works project than anything else. So he has done some truly important analysis in terms of what the future costs would be of some of these staggeringly expensive high-tech weapons that the military is looking at purchasing. So we'll hear from Lawrence Korb, Randall Forsberg from the Institute for Defense and Disarmament Studies, and John Steinbrunner. Each of them has spent years doing research in this field, and if I can lure them up here to the front, we're going to ask each one of you to make a short presentation, and let us begin with Mr. Korb, and again our welcome and our thanks for all that you've done, and know that I've in particular spent a fair amount of time reading some of the analyses you've done of these high-tech weapons, and I think your work is extraordinarily important, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Senator. Thank you very much, Senator. Congressman Dellums is a tough act to follow, and I won't try to. I'll just try and add and supplement a couple of things that he said. I believe we can afford to spend more money on defense, but I don't think that we have to. There's no doubt about the fact that we have a lot of other pressing needs, but I think that if you put it in the sense that, well, we should, but we can't, I think that doesn't help the terms of the debate. I don't think that we have to. And I also think that you need to keep in mind, no matter how much money you spend, you can't ever buy perfect security. You can't not have 100% assuredness that you will cover every possible contingency. The question is, how did we get into this particular position that we are now, where, as Senator Wyden just said, we're spending so much more than the rest of the world? A number of reasons, some of which Congressman Dellums mentioned. We've overestimated the threat. The late Les Aspin, who was the father of the bottom-up review, and after he left office, people were complaining that he had, in fact, ruined the Pentagon by not providing enough money for defense. And he pointed out that when they did the bottom-up review and they decided what forces we would need to fight the North Koreans, the military analysis was that a North Korean fighting person was the equivalent of an American fighting person, and that a South Korean was only 70% as effective. Well, it's hard to believe that South Korea, a country that has much more modern weapons, does much more training, that has twice the population, would not be as effective as a North Korean, or that a North Korean fighting person could be as effective as an American. If one were to do a more reasonable analysis and say, well, let's assume that an American fighting person is the standard, he or she gets a value of 1.0, and that a North Korean gets a value of 0.5, then in fact what the military argues that you need to prevail and on the Korean Peninsula would literally be cut in half. Congressman Dellums also mentioned we underplayed the role of our allies. It seems that we assume that if we go back to the Persian Gulf, was ostensibly to protect not only our access to oil, but the Europeans, that somehow or another the Europeans wouldn't come. And one of the great ironies is the Europeans know that we're planning that way, so they're cutting their defense forces much more rapidly than we are. The third problem that you have is the debate has turned into accounting gimmicks. People are arguing, for example, that Bill Clinton is spending less on the military than Ronald Reagan, and they talk about how much defense has been cut since the height of the Reagan buildup. There's no doubt about the fact that that's true, but the United States or Bill Clinton's military is not going to go to war with Ronald Reagan's military. It's going to go to war with all the militaries in the world. Similarly, people will make statements that today's Army is smaller than it was before Pearl Harbor, which again, if you take a look at it, literally that is correct. But the fact of the matter is our Army today is much more lethal in terms of the power that it can project and the firepower that it can bring to bear. And if you look around at other armies in the world, they're a lot smaller than they were before Pearl Harbor. The fourth reason is that there's a lot of misnomers about what constitutes readiness and how much we need for modernization. People talk about the fact that we're having problems in the readiness of the military, but yet if you look at readiness spending per capita, even if you control for inflation, it is higher than it was at the height of the Cold War. And people argue that every time you deploy forces that somehow you undermine their readiness, not taking into account that you get some very real training when you go into places like Haiti or to Bosnia or to Rwanda. Similarly, when we talk about modernization, the figure that we need $60 billion a year to modernize our force leaves out the fact that nobody else in the world is spending anywhere near what we're spending on modernization now. My colleague John Steinbrenner, in a piece he did in our book, Setting National Priorities, looked at the rest of the world, and you find out nobody else is modernizing. So in a sense, we again come into a race exactly with ourselves. The fifth reason, and I think you have to be honest about this, is politics both at the local level and the national level. And by local, I mean people arguing to keep weapon systems alive even when they don't need to be. The Bush administration, General Powell tried to cancel the V-22, the tilt-rotor Osprey. It was kept alive by a coalition of people from both parties from Pennsylvania and Texas. The Bush administration only wanted to build one Seawolf submarine. The New England delegation, most of whom are Democrats, rose up against it, and President Clinton in the 1992 campaign, in order to win votes in New England, endorsed it, and we ended up building three of those submarines at a cost of about $13 billion. So you still have this local concern, and you've got depot caucuses and air power caucuses up here on the Hill that every time you try and make a reduction in defense spending that impacts on a particular area, people from both parties rise up. You also have national politics. In terms of cutting defense spending, two things that happened in the 90s really made it hard. One was that we got a Democratic president who is afraid of being seen as soft on defense. And Bill Clinton, in his first couple of months in office, tried to cut defense spending, but after being in office in a year, he announced there would be no further reductions in defense, and he has himself added money to his own defense program, as well as signed the extra money that the Republicans have put in. And the Republicans feel that President Clinton's vulnerable on this issue, so they keep pushing more money into defense. And then finally, you have what I would just call poor management. The Defense Science Board recently, and they are certainly not critics of the Pentagon, said you could save up to $30 billion a year if you privatize more of the functions, you rely more on civilians and military people. Well, that might be a little bit overstated, but the fact of the matter is there are some significant savings. Similarly, if you take a look at the structures that we have, when I was in the Pentagon, I was an assistant secretary. As I look at the Pentagon now, my job, and not even all of it, to do that, you have one undersecretary, which is a step above, and 3 assistant secretaries. So here we have the Cold War over, and we have the staff in the Pentagon growing. People are talking about NATO expansion, and people criticize the UN for being a bureaucracy. Well, General Jack Sheehan, who runs the Atlantic Command, has pointed out that in NATO you have 67 commands, and it's hard to believe that you have much of a threat there. NATO bureaucracy would make the UN look very efficient, in my view. And then finally, we're not taking as much advantage of the technology as we should. Rather than just buying new platforms all the time, you can make your existing platforms better with precision-guided munitions and making use of information technologies, and even steps, if you believe that we need to keep as many carriers forward deployed, things like rotating the crews and leaving the carrier out there would save significant amounts of money. So that's the reasons why we're there. You'll hear from John and Randy about other more specific steps to cut. But I think it's important to keep in mind that unless the people make sure that their representatives know that there will not be a penalty for cutting that base or cutting that weapon systems, they will continue to do what they think we want. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker will be Randall Forsberg, who also has made a handout available. She has done a number of recent analyses. The one that seems to sum it up to me just perfectly is one that you'll see at the bottom of the page entitled Wasting Billions. But she has done extraordinarily good work, and I think we're going to enjoy this panel. Ms. Forsberg, welcome.
Thank you. Before I start, I want to mention that I've brought 2 reprints from the Boston Review, which are available on the table on the side, one entitled Wasting Billions, and the other Force Without Reason. And for our C-SPAN viewers, these articles are also available online at Boston Review at WebMIT.edu. I also have a handout which is being passed around right now, and which I'll speak to toward the end of at the end of my remarks after everybody has it in their hand. The goal that has been presented this morning of cutting the military budget to something around $200 billion over the next several years does represent an excellent start. But I think we need to keep in mind that it need not represent an end point. And in fact, we could move somewhat faster, and particularly after the year 2002, it could be possible to make much deeper cuts in the military budget if instead of relying entirely on unilateral planning, which is the basis for most of our discussion this morning, the United States government were to take the lead in promoting international arms limitation and arms control and arms reduction agreements that would allow cutbacks in our own forces and spending. These agreements should be negotiated during this coming 5-year period so that when we reach our first goal in reductions of military spending, we need not stop there, but can keep going into the next century. The reason is that we need not merely to restore the essential programs for safety, security, education, health, the arts, poverty, and crime combating in this country. We need equally to have an appropriate new policy for the post-Cold War period, which promotes peace and democracy throughout the world. A meaningful response to the end of the Cold War should be a new policy with 4 major goals, none of which have received much attention thus far. The first is to prevent the resurgence of great power military confrontation after the turn of the century with Russia or China or other new regional powers stepping in and creating new forms of militarized confrontation comparable to that of the Cold War. We're taking no steps to ensure that this does not happen again. The second is to prevent the emergence of major new regional military powers, which can threaten aggression, spur arms races, and in fact provide the rationale for the basis of high military spending in the United States, if not elsewhere. Thirdly, U.S. foreign and military policy should be oriented in such a way as to promote the development of democratic institutions within and among nations throughout the world. And finally, we should be aiming for a military policy which facilitates the peaceful resolution of the major regional conflicts apart from the Cold War, which have in fact accounted for virtually all of the world's arming hitherto, outside of the Cold War arming, and now that the Cold War is over, show the prospect of accounting almost entirely for world military spending and for U.S. military spending in particular. These are the conflicts between the 2 Koreas, China and Taiwan, India and Pakistan, which is less a U.S. concern but does absorb a lot of arms, the Arab-Israeli conflict, conflicts among Arab countries in the Middle East, and the conflict between Greece and Turkey. Together, these conflicts account for about 80% of the world trade in major armaments and in the export of armaments outside of the old Cold War arena of Europe, the United States, and Russia. What could the United States do to take the lead in promoting these important goals, which are now possible with the end of the Cold War? First of all, we should have, I'm going to recommend 4 or 5 major steps. The first is to have follow-on negotiations to the talks on conventional forces in Europe, negotiations on reducing standing conventional military forces, both globally and regionally, not only in Europe, but in the Pacific and in the other regions of conflict, engaging both the great powers and the major regional powers. There is no reason now that the dangers of the Cold War are over to stop paying attention to arms control and arms reduction as a means of advancing national and international security. On the contrary, in this period of lull, when no major military power sees any other power as an imminent threat, this is the time to seize the moment and get agreements for much lower force levels, which will be sealed into place and head off those future remilitarized relations. Secondly, along with reducing standing forces, there should be an effort by the United States to win agreement with the handful of other countries which account for all of the world's production and export of advanced conventional weaponry. They are Britain, France, Germany, and Russia. Just 4 countries, along with the United States, completely control the world trade and major weapon platforms. And we are now in a position with these countries to choose to stop the exports to those regional conflicts, which are the very justification for our 2-war strategy. Instead of writing off $20 billion a year worth of arms export income, what we're doing is paying $200 billion a year. Did I say million? It's probably billion. $20 billion a year worth of arms export income. We're spending $200 billion to respond to the exports that will be made by Russia and China and Europe to those regional conflicts in which the United States is preparing to intervene unilaterally. Surely there must be something within the grasp, within the reach of the United States that we could offer as incentives to Europe, Russia, and China to join with us in stopping these spiraling regional arms races which justify our enormous military budget. Thirdly, if we do cut back our standing conventional forces and stop arms exports, this would create a situation which is more acute even than the one we are in today, in which the arms industries in the United States really have nothing to do. In fact, we have already reached a situation, because of the post-Cold War cutbacks in the United States, Europe, and separately in the Third World, in which arms industries in the United States are being kept going by the production of weapons that are not needed to fill out our forces. In fact, viable, service-worthy systems in our forces are being retired early to make way for new aircraft, new submarines, new aircraft carriers, which are being built solely for the purpose of keeping the industries open. This, along with the fact that for the first time in history, the United States and Russia are now producing both more weapons for export than for domestic use. So finally, we have had this situation turn itself on its head, where instead of maintaining an arms industry for national security, we're shaping our national security policy in order to maintain an arms industry. So my third major step would be that we must develop an industrial reserve system where we learn how to preserve technological know-how and skills and building capacity as an insurance policy against future needs without producing weapons for ourselves of which we have no need, or for export which only exacerbate regional conferences. The combination of these three steps, reducing conventional forces, stopping major arms exports, and converting to an industrial reserve system, would have an additional benefit in building confidence and heading off future regional and great power militarization. That benefit is that it would slow the rate of modernization, because it would slow the rate of introduction of major new weapon systems, both among the great powers in the United States, Europe, Russia, and China, and also in third world arms races. The final step that I think the United States should be taking the lead in is an awful lot of leadership called for here. That we haven't seen to date, but maybe today will mark a turning point. The United States should be taking the lead in attempting to develop multilateral peace enforcement capability to replace U.S. unilateral peace enforcement capability, intervention capability. If we want to promote the growth of democratic institutions and to undermine and eventually see the end of dictators with repressive policies at home and aggressive policies abroad, the United States should be setting an example by supporting the rule of law and participating in an international security system which is not an ad hoc affair of deciding to intervene to end some conflicts but not others when it's in our interest, because that is exactly the policy of people like Saddam Hussein, who decide to intervene when it suits their national interest. The United States must support the rule of law, and that means that we must participate in multilateral efforts to keep the peace rather than arrogating this right and responsibility totally to ourselves, not to speak of the cost. The implications of the kind of policy that I just described are set out in the handout which I distributed, and which I would like to just describe very briefly for those who don't have it. It shows the size of U.S. nuclear and conventional military forces as they were in 1990, when the estimated cost in today's dollars, in constant $97, was about $370 billion. It shows how these forces have been cut back by roughly 1/3, less in the nuclear area, but about 1/3 in the conventional area. And the overall cost has gone down to $260 billion. This cost, this reduction, I think it's important to keep in mind, does not represent, in a sense, a real reduction. It represents a return to the level of Cold War forces which existed throughout the period from 1950 to 1980, prior to the Reagan buildup. Throughout that entire 30-year period, as shown in this chart in the article Force Without Reason, the United States had military spending within $20 billion of the present $260 billion. So we've just now returned from the excesses of the Reagan administration to normal Cold War military spending with $260 billion and with this one-third reduction. At a recent talk in Boston, Barney Frank, if I understood him right, sort of hurried up some of the goals presented today and said that he thought that we should be able to cut back to $200 billion by the year 2000. Did I get you right? Yes, which I would support and agree with, not the year 2002. That would be a reduction of, on the order, 17 or 18 billion a year over the next, or 20 billion a year over the next 3 years instead of 17 or 18 billion a year. A number of years ago, at the outset of the end of the Cold War in 1992, William Kaufman, who for 20 years actually drafted the annual report of the Secretary of Defense from 1960 to 1980, in the book Decisions for Defense, argued that over the period to 2002, the United States could in fact cut back unilaterally to an even lower figure, 170 billion. He was then allowing for a longer period of time to make that reduction. Nevertheless, the cutbacks that he proposed still represent a reasonable goal today. And for those looking at the chart, what you can see is that in comparison with the forces that are planned for 1998 and which the United States currently plans to maintain for the indefinite future, what Kaufman had suggested was that we should cut those forces by about another third. What that would do is leave forces 1.5 times the size of the force the United States used in the Gulf War. 1.5 times. So with forces 1.5 times the Gulf War force, we could have a military budget of $170 billion. Now, in thinking about that, it's important to keep in mind that in today's world, there is no country more than half as strong as Iraq was at the start of the Gulf War. Nor can any country except North Korea and Syria, which show no prospect of doing so, become even as strong, let alone stronger, than Iraq was at the outset of the Gulf War. In fact, there is no prospect of a major war like the Gulf War. The closest we could come in today's world is a catastrophe between the two Koreas, where the scale of U.S. forces is not going to make too much difference because of the localization of the events. There is no prospect of a major war of Gulf War scale in the Middle East with any parties at any time before the year 2010. And I just want to underscore that means we're spending $100 billion a year to guard against a war which cannot occur for over a decade. So Kaufman's relatively conservative proposal was that we guard against one of these wars and then we have some extra forces so they can stay at home and be in Europe and be in Japan, and people will feel comfortable and won't say, well, you'd have to strip the entire United States if there were another, even one Gulf War. My proposal is that if we follow up on that 1.5 Gulf War strategy and we pursue that unilaterally for the next 5 years, while at the same time negotiating arms reductions, a halt to arms exports, an industrial reserve system, and commitment to multilateral peacekeeping, then in the subsequent 5 years, we could keep cutting at more or less the same rate, on the order of 10% a year, and we could get the U.S. military budget down to $100 billion a year, which would still be twice as big as that of any other country, and would give the United States the capability to represent not more than half of the forces in any major multilateral peacekeeping intervention. That, I think, should be our goal as a leader for peace and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. Ron Wyden had to go off temporarily, but we'll be back. And as a lead-in to John Steinbrenner, Randy talked about his collaborator, William Kaufman. John Steinbrenner, who had been the Director of Relevant Studies at International Security Studies at Brookings and is still at Brookings now, recently co-authored with William Kaufman the chapter on national security in Brookings' annual volume. And I must say, having read that whole volume, I would defy anyone to read that book and then tell us that it's possible to get the budget deficit down to zero, keep military spending where it is, and not have an absolutely devastating effect on virtually every other function that we try as a civilized society to accomplish through our federal government. John Steinbrenner has been a very acute student of military matters for some time and is one of the most articulate and thoughtful spokesmen for the point of view that we can reduce to a much lower level than we now are without in any way jeopardizing American national security. John.
As Barney said, I'm speaking from this volume. I'm sorry I can't hand it out. Our marketing department objects to that. And this volume conveys the message that Barney has just stated. I think it's a fundamental message. We have big problems here. If we try to pursue a balanced budget under the trajectory of current defense planning, we're looking at social devastation. And my own opinion is that can't possibly happen. But in order to prevent it from happening, we've got a big debate to go, and it has to do fundamentally about the nature of security. And most of my remarks are very much in the context of what has already been said. Let me just sort of make some points for emphasis. First of all, we have a yet bigger problem, I think, than has yet been specified in the trajectory of current defense spending. Current forces are being underfinanced against traditional planning standards and traditional accounting procedures by about $70 billion in the investment account, and that might actually double for the entire budget if you try to finance them in the historic way. And that means that they are going to be trying to absorb all the conceivable efficiencies you might get within the defense budget to sustain basic financing of those forces. That means that if we are going to have any real allocation of money from the defense effort to something else, there's going to have to be fundamental changes in defense planning assumptions. But let me go on to say that we ought to make those changes anyway, regardless of the fiscal pressures, because we've got a mismatch at the moment between the way we're doing security planning and the circumstances we actually face. We have cut our forces by about 30% since the end of the Cold War in 1990, and the budget by that amount. But we've not altered the fundamental planning assumptions. We're still running Cold War operations, which means preparation for mass attack on very short notice, both with regard to nuclear weapons and with regard to conventional forces. It's the mass attack on short notice that costs us all the money, and I would say presents most of the dangers as well, as a matter of fact. We need to notice that at the moment, there is no current competitor that is forcing us to conduct these Cold War operations. The potential competitor, I mean, the ones we talk about, Iraq and North Korea, are simply not in our league. The potential competitors over the long term, Russia and China, are more than 2 decades away from fielding forces that would have commensurate capabilities of power projection, commensurate to ours and our allies, and they're not yet currently making the effort, nor do I think we want them to make such an effort, nor do they have incentives to make such an effort. So we've got this badly wrong, and we need to redirect what we're basically about. Just to be a little bit specific on that, in this volume, we attribute to Russia and China investment resources much larger in all probability than they're actually spending. And we allocate that to their forces, which are nominally very large. And we observe simply that at a per unit basis, their investment rates are less than 10% of those of the United States alone. And we come in the context of an alliance system that includes all the other major military powers. they're not in the ball game in terms of global power projection, and they're not even attempting to get there. And if they did attempt to get there, they would have to increase their investment rates improbably more than they will, and it would take them 2 or 3 decades even so. So we're running a Cold War operation outside in a context that simply doesn't justify it. The problem that we're really facing is very different character. It's not a problem of mass attack on short notice. It's a problem of diffuse violence, having to do with the disintegration of societies and the kind of spontaneous civil violence and clandestine terrorism that emerges from those circumstances. We do not have forces configured for that situation. Our forces can adapt to any one of these local situations, Bosnia, Rwanda, et cetera, but it's obvious that we don't have the conceptualization of policy or the international organization required to react responsibly to those circumstances. In particular, we act too late. We do not take advantage of early action to prevent these violence from occurring, and therefore we present ourselves a tremendous problem once they get to be of large scale. The potential for a large number of these instances could literally be overwhelming. At any rate, we don't have a military force configured for this sort of thing. Mass deterrent operations have nothing to do with this. Traditional, large-scale, conventional military operations have very little to do with it. It's an entirely different kind of problem, which you want to react to in terms of prevention rather than reaction. So what I'm saying is that we have, for fundamental security reasons, a tremendous transition to go through. To have better security and more appropriate security and a better configuration of our military forces. Now, it is convenient that we can go through this and achieve a better outcome at lower cost. And that therefore there is not only an imperative for security adjustment, but a major opportunity to relieve the fiscal pressures that Barney is referring to. The numbers that we've generated in this volume are similar to the ones you've already heard and to the program that Randy just laid out. The obvious logic in the situation is to set common standards for force deployment worldwide and restraints on military arms sales, something we're going to have to do anyway to deal with the underlying problem of civil violence I just referred to. And if we don't discover that now, there'll be some major grief later on that will rivet our attention on that fact. Both Russia and China cannot themselves afford their current forces. They will have to reduce them to even maintain coherence. And coherence in Russian military is very much a problem at the moment, a very serious problem. In fact, that's the #1 security problem worldwide, not the inclination for aggression, either on their borders or more distant, but their ability to maintain the coherence of a military establishment that still has possession of many dangerous assets. They're in deep trouble, and we're imposing on them an unhealthy amount of pressure, not realizing what we're doing. Okay, now the obvious way out of this situation is to set lower force deployment standards such that a major contingency cannot arise against anyone. That's the logic of what Randy was talking about, is worldwide force level standards and military sales standards. That is quite in principle an achievable thing, and if we should do that, we could preserve our current capability to, if you will, stop a major contingency should it arise at much with lower force levels and much smaller amounts of investment. Potentially, our figures indicate that you can reduce the defense budget on the order of $100 billion a year and still preserve all the capability that we currently have and have it configured much better for these new circumstances. My main message is that for fundamental security reasons, we're going to have to rethink this. We're going to have to change the underlying planning principles because they are misallocated to security requirements. But in the course of that, we can achieve tremendous efficiencies in spending on the order of $100 billion a year. Let me say this will not happen, however, until there is much more of a public discussion than is currently occurring. The quadrennial review will not raise these issues. The quadrennial review, very predictably, is going to sustain Cold War planning assumptions, 2 major contingencies, and a standard mass attack deterrent operation. We have something of a crisis of democracy in front of us here. We've come out of a 40-year period in which we've deeply ingrained not only the force structure, but the security planning assumptions, which really involve a replay of World War II, which we failed to prevent and then won gloriously. We're now continuously going through the exercise of preventing that sort of thing, should it ever arise again. That's not our problem at the moment. And in fact, the way we're going about it runs a greater risk of stimulating not that kind of a problem, but very dangerous counteractions to our dominant military capability. This society has to rethink the principles of security for security reasons, and in the course of that has an opportunity to achieve tremendous efficiencies in defense spending and a release of money to much more urgent purposes. It won't happen until there's more of a public discussion than is currently going on, so I hope all of you will participate in that. Thank you.
Thank you. To begin the question period, I want to reemphasize what John said. I sadly must say that there has probably been more fundamental discussion about what national security policy ought to look like in these last couple of hours here than we have had in this building in a very long time, because we have been dealing within a very constrained set of circumstances. And I and some others have tried to raise this from time to time. It hasn't gone anywhere, and people understandably ask, what's different about this year? And the answer is the budget. We are, for the first time, not just in a zero-sum budget, but in I don't know what the mathematical term is, it's a minus zero-sum budget. Because we're in a situation in which we have not a fixed amount of money to divide up between military and non-military purposes, but a shrinking amount of money, which means over the next 5 years, if the military share stays roughly what it is, the non-military share that you see up there in that great chart that the Council for Livable World has done drops beyond what anybody thinks is a reasonable amount if you're going to try to deal with any of these problems. So I think that's the transforming situation. We have a very different reality in the world, and we have a very different reality domestically. A national commitment to a zero deficit in the year 2002, although, as you know, some weeks after the fiscal year had ended in 1996, we couldn't come within $6 or $7 billion of what the deficit had been in the fiscal year that just ended. We are much more sure about what it will be in the year 2002, but that's a common phenomenon. The further away an event is, the more certain you can be in how you describe it. But we're going to get to zero, and this is going to generate a pressure that I think transforms this situation. Now, for our 3 panelists, if there are any questions or comments to which you would like them to respond, please ask them. Since we don't have 4 mics, we'll ask them to summarize the question. Oh, we do have a 4 mic. I take it back. Yes, sir. Thank you.
The question I raise is this: why is it that the highly industrial nations have a budget of $35 to $45 billion on theirs, and yet ours is 270? Why is that much?
All right, let's, anybody want to start with that? Yes.
Yeah, I try to outline that in my presentation. There's a combination of political factors. The fact is, if we cut our spending, then people will have to look for other forms of employment. And many in the Congress have balked at that when you've tried to bring it down. You have a perception where the so-called new Democrats don't want to be perceived as weak on defense, and so you have a president who, after his first year in office, tried to reduce military spending, has raised it every single year. You have Republicans who feel that the president is weak on defense, that will keep pushing him on that. You also have what I would call these accounting gimmicks. People are comparing today's military spending to the level of the 80s, the height of the Reagan buildup, and that sort of says to people, well, defense has taken more than their fair share of reductions because you're comparing it to the height of the Reagan buildup, which, as Randy pointed out, means that really what we're back to is the average Cold War level. But by using that, if you will, type of analysis, that convinces people who don't follow it closely enough that you've already done too much in defense. And I think the military is a very skillful lobbying group. I mean, they're able to come up here on the Hill and talk about, you know, what a dangerous world it is and how busy they are doing all these things, and nobody wants to take them on. I wrote recently in Charlie Peters' Washington Monthly that I don't think the situation will get where it needs to be until you get an Eisenhower or a Nixon in the White House type of Republican and the Democrats back in control of the Congress.
Let me add one other factor that I think is a problem here, and that's there's a genuine cultural lag here. I mean, it made a great deal of sense in 1945 for the United States to take on the military burden for the rest of the world, which was poor and which had to recover. And that has become sort of ingrained. You define responsibility here by your willingness to have America shoulder the burdens. It is a very paradoxical situation with regard to our European and Asian allies, where people in America who are often very assertive about American interests make an exception where military spending is concerned, and argue that we somehow gain great influence by this, that the process by which we spend a lot and they spend a little somehow enhances our influence. I must say I don't see it, and the notion that we can only have allies if we lavish great spending on their defense seems to me to be flawed. But that's part of what we have to deal with. But I think, by the way, that's also one of the political points of entry. Efforts to even out, to some extent, or at least level down the differences in spending, which we call burden sharing here, have some appeal, and I think you're going to see some more efforts there. Yes, over there.
I heard Lawrence Korb talk about the fact that local politics gets in the way of cutting the defense budget. And one thing I heard is that just about every congressional district has some type of military contractor, and I'm just wondering how we're going to get around that if everybody has
I'm going to begin with that, and it's true. And this is where I think the zero-sum situation changes things. Yes, I have military contractors in my district, and I have the Seawolf submarine, a wonderful submarine, a great weapon. I think its only defect is the absence of an enemy, which I think in a weapon that's a fairly serious shortcoming. But it's built close to my district. It used to be coastal before my district changed. I regret telling people who work there that I'm not going to vote to keep it going, and that's a pressure. But here's what's transformed it. It is also true that every congressman has educational activity in his district, and every congressman has health care going on in her district, and every member of Congress has environmental problems in his or her district. And we are now in a different situation. When the discussion was, should you cut your military spending or not, then a lot of people would say, well, I don't want to cut the spending. But now the question is, should we cut your military spending, or should we cut the number of cops on the street that you get through the recent bill, and your health care, and your environmental programs, and your transportation, and your education, etc., then it's a different situation. That's why I believe that's been a terrible problem up till now, but we have at least potentially a transforming situation, because it's not now cut spending in your district versus not cut it, but which spending in your district do you want to see cut? Anyone else want to?
I want to add something. I think it's going to, certainly that will be one countervailing weight, but the other thing that's happening is we've had an unprecedented consolidation in the defense industry, and you've got three giants out there now, Lockheed Martin, Loral, you've got Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, and you have the Raytheon Hughes, Texas Instrument combination. And the political power of these three companies is going to make it more difficult to do what Congressman Frank wants, because if you want to hit a Lockheed program, for example, the F-22, in Georgia, not only do you have to confront that delegation, but you've got to confront all of the other Lockheed Martin Loral employees, which literally cover every district.
It's true, but I just want to emphasize again, and I should have said this, the people here are the ones who can make that difference, because we have unfortunately gotten to a situation where if you vote to cut education in your district, you're considered a patriot because you're reducing the deficit. But if you vote to maintain military spending, you're also a patriot because you're defending us. And that's part of what we have to do is to put that into the mix. Yeah, Randy.
Could I add something? Yes. I think an important part of the answer is being a little bit taken for granted by all of us. 95% of the people pay the taxes, which employ 5% of the people who are supported by the military budget. This is true in every district, more or less. So what we need is to have some part of that 95% get mobilized and get in touch with their Congress people and senators and say, we're going to vote on this issue. We're going to be influenced in how we vote on this issue. That process of having lots of people who have some interest oppose a few people who have a very great vested interest. What we need is something comparable to what happened with the nuclear freeze campaign in the early 1980s, when people were looking at this nuclear arms race thing and saying, but it's run by the experts and it's done in Washington and I don't have any influence and I don't know about these things and how can I change it? But in fact, there was kind of a place where the balance tipped and people said, it's my life, it's my money, it's my security, I don't want to live this way anymore, and I'm going to spend some of my free time out there volunteering and being an activist and taking the heat and being embarrassed and having the inconveniences to try to change this. So we do need for people who are not only people in traditional peace and peace organizations, peace-related organizations, but also people in all of the areas that would benefit from a change in national priorities, which is really what can make this kind of difference. And what, in fact, did make the difference with the nuclear freeze campaign is that people in all of these other organizations and sectors of life said, hey, this affects me, I care, this is going to be one of the goals of my organization, nationally and locally. And without that kind of process, it will not be possible to overcome the vested interests.
Yep, behind them.
Has this country or any other country ever successfully executed a conversion strategy so that either the resources going into military goods was in fact converted in some way into civilian uses, or the technology in that particular company, if it was external, was converted with the same workers and the same interests into a civilian use?
Without losing a war first.
Pardon me?
Several people have done it having lost a war. I guess we
Okay.
mean without losing a war first as the transition. John?
This has historically been difficult if you're talking about conversion of actual plants and workers to some other activity. Conversion usually is what we call macroeconomic conversion, which is the given activities disperse into the broader economy and they're not preserved as a coherent unit. There are very few cases in which a defense producer transforms itself into a civilian producer using the same people and the same organization. That proves to be, in our economy and everyone else's, a very hard thing to do.
Could I make a constructive suggestion? I think there is an opportunity to bring about an equivalent to a conversion if we think in terms of incentives for the dependent people to convert. And the kinds of things, this would involve using some defense funds that you're cutting, not immediately in the first year shifting them over to non-defense areas, but using them to provide an incentive to get people to want to take part in this process. And the kinds of incentives I have in mind are early retirement, relocation allowances, retraining allowances, and community-based reinvestment programs, and tax incentives for corporations that create businesses in high unemployment areas. All of these things would tend to draw people away and give them a reason and a mechanism for moving on into the kind of macro level conversion that John was just referring to, rather than trying to keep the plan in place. But just as a footnote, The Chinese have actually succeeded in doing this. In the 1980s, they were building airplanes with engines that were so poorly constructed that they fell apart when the planes flew. And they decided there really wasn't any point in building these planes until they could get some new engines from the United States or Europe, which they're only recently starting to do. But they didn't really want to stop permanently. So what they did was they instructed all of their, not all, but some of these factories that they must find a civilian alternative, and they ended up building bicycles and sewing machines. And this actually happened, and some of them went broke, but some of them made it.
I should note, too, that one of the changes that happened with the changeover in control of Congress was some efforts we had made to put some money into the defense budget for conversion was substantially cut out. When the Republicans took over, they cut out the conversion money. Yeah, we'll take 2 more questions over there, and then we're going to...
Thank you. My name is Gordon Clark with Peace Action. I'm very encouraged to hear several of the speakers talk about the international weapons trade as one of the causative factors driving up our budget, military budget, the procurement budget, and we certainly know that companies like Lockheed Martin sort of engage in what I call a self-fulfilling prophecy marketing, where they'll talk about all the F-15s and F-16s out there as part of what we need to defend ourselves, why we need the F-22. If the United States actually took a leadership role in restraining the arms trade, both our own sales and other countries' sales, what would our procurement needs actually be? I mean, right now that seems to be a big chunk of the budget that's going up.
I think we have the question out.
Thanks.
Anybody? Barry?
I think you raise a great point, and if you read Mary McGrory's column yesterday, she talked about the Hatfield-McKinney bill that would have an arms sales code of conduct, and it was roundly defeated in both houses. But it was very interesting who voted for it. One of the people who voted for it was Bob Dornan, and it was also John Kasich supported it. And I found myself in a strange position of coming up and testifying for it and being opposed by members of the Clinton administration. And so after that, we saw that as Bill Perry and Warren Christopher were leaving office, they tried to end the bail on sales to Latin America, which was something we hadn't done in a while. And you're quite right, because the F-22 is now being justified not as something to deal with the next generation of Soviet MiG, but to deal with the 15s and the 16s that we have put out there. And recently, Thailand has asked to say if they wanted to buy American planes, they also want American missiles, and they want the AMRAAM missile, which is probably one of the most sophisticated missiles we have, and it looks like they're going to get it in order to buy the American plane. So then we'll need a new generation of plane or missiles to deal with the AMRAAM.
Jim, we'll take the last question here from Jim.
Well, I wanted to thank, on behalf of the Unemployment Poverty Action Committee, thank you and Senator Wyden for organizing this forum. I think it's very important, and that we have to keep these discussions going, because it is true the budget is there, and what are we going to do about poor people? But I was wondering, for Mr. Stein, could you tell us a little bit about the book, the name of the book that you, and something about it?
Hold it up, John.
You go around with him often, Jim?
Pardon me?
You go around with him often?
Thank you, sir. This is called Setting National Priorities. It's edited by Robert Reischauer, and it's published in January by Brookings. And it sets out the situation, again, that Barney described, that we have a crisis coming here in fiscal policy, that to achieve a balanced budget and the time projected, holding defense spending not only constant, but trying to actually increase it to preserve current forces would produce, as he calls it, social devastation. And therefore we have an unusually serious judgment of priorities for this society coming in front of us, and we have not yet begun the debate that will be required, and that's what this book is trying to say.
I can only say we're going to have to draw this to a close, but we remember we will have another panel. There'll be more questions. First, Randy Forsberg mentions that there are reprints there, and you can order more reprints for free, and it tells you how to do that. My thanks to the panel. Let me just close with one thing, because people ask some understandably skeptical questions. You know, why is this year going to be different than all other years? And let me say, first of all, I believe that the budget crunch we are coming to is potentially transforming, but we can see that it won't happen automatically. If we thought it would happen automatically, we wouldn't have asked you to give up today and come here. I would have taken the day off, because with the new Republican leadership, we don't vote on anything, so I didn't have to come to work today. We're here because we believe that the reality gives us the opportunity but without the organizing that you collectively represent, it won't happen. So we think we have the